How can we use some of the medical data from overseas, for example, from clinical trials? How can we use some of that in, for example, our PBAC processes to make some medicines available more easily here in Australia?
So we do use, PBAC does use data from international studies. Clinical trials are conducted all over the world, and that evidence is considered by PBAC when it comes to its decision. But there are some decisions where the local environment is an important part of making a good decision. And those circumstances, of course, require local data to confirm that the observations made in other studies are also going to apply in an Australian context. For example, the necessity to perform genomic profiling for a study might be something that might be different in one country from in Australia. The test might be performed overseas, and the performance of that test overseas may not be acceptable to the Australian taxpayer and the reimbursement system. So PBAC does use international data, and it also sometimes needs to generate local data. And then there's also, you might be meaning, well, why don't we combine our data? And that's definitely true for rare cancer. So there are national cohorts in the UK and many parts of Europe and in the US which are collecting data on rare cancer patients. And there's no reason why the entities that are performing those studies oughtn't pool their data to answer particularly difficult questions about particularly rare cancers.
Yeah, excellent. In terms of clinical trials, how can we make it more attractive for our international colleagues to bring their clinical trials to Australia?
We can make it more attractive by providing the sort of molecular screening that's required to identify the patients for those trials. Remember, 91% of drugs currently in trials have been designed against a target, and if you can't identify who's got which target, then you can't do the trial. Or you have to pay for that infrastructure yourself, which is just not something that's sustainable in the longer term. The fact that the government might provide universal access to molecular profiling would turn Australia into a perfect environment in which to conduct these biomarker-dependent drug trials, and I think that's an important part of the answer to your question. I think the other thing is to try and incentivize the conduct of clinical trials within our hospitals as part of a standard of care, and that will require resourcing and a perception change that clinical trials represent an important, indeed, I would say, an obligatory part of standard of care. And that's a kind of policy decision, and it's a policy decision at the state government level as well as nationally. What else would make it? I think the final part of the answer to your question is we need to complete the circle. There's no point in having companies come into Australia to do the trials if we don't ultimately make those drugs available in a funded way through the PBS and MBS. You can see what happens if you don't do that. In New Zealand, there are now only 3 companies which have offices in New Zealand, and it's not just because of the size of the country, it's because there was progressive disengagement and loss of funding into new medicines. Australia can't follow that path, because if it does, it will simply mean that the global pharmaceutical industry will not only take its drugs out of the country, but it'll take its trials out of the country, and we'll all be the worse off.
How does a rare cancer patient access genomic testing?
Email me.
Simple. When do you think that we'll be able to expand this testing to include, early stage diagnosis testing, so beyond things like Prospect and Zero that exist at the moment?
Well, the first thing is to take testing outside of medical research funded grants that are time limited and make it a part of standard of care. Once we've got that beachhead for patients who really desperately need treatment options because they're incurable, we'll find naturally that the drugs will migrate earlier in the cancer journey, just as Georgina Long described beautifully today. There's no question that the earlier in the cancer journey effective drugs are used, the more likely the patient is to benefit from it. And the later you use those drugs in the patient journey, the more likely the patient is to be too sick to be able to potentially receive it at all, let alone benefit. So I think that will happen. It will move earlier in the cancer journey. As the drugs move earlier in the cancer journey, the testing will follow, because the testing is only performed in order to find the patients for the treatments. So ultimately, it's a kind of chicken and egg question. When the drugs move earlier in the cancer journey, the testing will follow so that we can identify the patients that will benefit from those drugs.
Excellent. What does a better world for rare mean to you?
I think universal access to genomic and other molecular profiling that will substitute for what is currently an ineffective paradigm. We know that because of rarity or because we don't know where cancers begin in the first place, anatomy and the light microscope are of no use to participating in the research paradigm that has absolutely transformed outcomes for other cancer types. If we can use a molecular lens to rethink how we group rare cancer patients together, we'll enable them for the first time to take part in rational drug development. And I think because they've been neglected for decades now, I think the progress will be particularly dramatic. That's what I want. I want the molecular testing to be universally available and all of the effective therapies that depend upon that testing also to be universally available.
Why are events like CanForum so important for the cancer sector and the community?
CanForum is important for the sector and the community because it provides a venue where all the stakeholders who have to get together to make a difference are present to hear the arguments about why we should try. Outside of CanForum, you might lack government, the parliamentarians, our representatives, the bureaucracy and the departments and their perspectives. You won't be able to bring them next to sitting in the same seats with the industry and the stakeholders who make decisions about whether to bring trials of new drugs into the country or even to put them forward for listing. And of course, you bring the patients' voices into the conversation so that all of those groups can hear what it's really like at the pointy end of a cancer diagnosis. And I think also you get clinicians and leading clinicians who attend this and tell everybody what the state of the art promises, what could be achieved if we had the will.